this is a class for Professor John Lee. It's the so-called Rethinking Social Theory in the Eastern Asia. Since this is the first class of this course, and I would like to give a very brief introduction to Professor John Lee. But before I make an introduction to Professor John Lee, and I would like to express our warmest greeting to Professor Lee. Professor Lee can come to our department and give a short-term course. It's really our honor. It's our deep honor to have him here. And I was told by the university administrator that Professor Lee's lecture is the first such kind of example of exchange teachers in this university for the social sciences. So it's really our deep honor to have him here. Okay, so I would like to introduce Professor Lee for a little bit. And Professor Lee was born in South Korea and grew up in Japan and Hawaii, and attended Harvard University, and where he got his bachelor degree and a PhD degree. And Professor Lee's special field are in social theory, and political economy, and Eastern Asia. And taking the Cyril Mill's notion of the sociological imagination as an example, and he studied the intersection of biography, history, and the social structures. And his study along this long line developed into trilogy, which means 3 books, and which include the first book is called The Blue Dreams. It's talking about Korean American and the Los Angeles riots. And then the second book is about Han Unbound. It's talking about the political economy of South Korea. And then the third one is the so-called multi-ethnic Japan. And recently there is a recent addition to this corpus, and which is Zainichi. Zainichi is called the Koreans in Japan. And it's talking about so-called diasporic nationalism and the post-colonial identity. And this is also published by the University of California Press. And Professor Lee's main scholarly interest is social theory. That's also the reason why he wants to give this class. It's rethinking social theory and East Asia. And I would like to say, Professor also devoted considerate energy to undergraduate teaching and academic administration. And before joining the Berkeley faculty, Professor Lee was head of sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign for 5 years. And he also directed the Center for Japanese Study and the Korean Studies program at the University of Michigan. And in addition to Illinois and Michigan, he has taught at the University of Hawaii, and Yonsei University is in South Korea, and also University of Oregon, and Keio University in Japan, and also in National Taiwan University, but it's about 13 years old, 16 years ago. Okay. So he has been here before, and several other institutes around the world. Okay, so this time he comes to Taiwan to do a short-term teaching, and under the so-called Top University Strategic Alliance Agreement between UC Berkeley and Taiwan, so-called 麦鼎计划. So, and this is an extraordinary opportunity to students and academia in Taiwan. And so we have to cherish this opportunity. And so let's welcome Professor John Lee.
Well, thank you for your very kind introduction, Professor Ko, and it's really my pleasure to be here to be able to spend some time discussing topics of mutual interest. I will be here Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, pretty much all day in my office, which is in 310, I believe. No, not 310. That's yours.
That's mine.
Yeah, that's yours.
303.
303. So if you'd like to talk to me or ask me questions, just come by. And if you want to make sure I'm there, please email me beforehand. It's John Lee at berkeley.edu. Also, I will try to give you the PowerPoint before class so you can just follow it. I'll ask Professor Wu later how I might do that. The final thing is, if you like to read some background material on what I'll be lecturing, please see my book. It's called Modern Peoplehood. And there are several articles in the website www.academia.edu. And in particular, there are two articles you may be interested in. One is called Asian Studies, Global Studies. And the second one is called The Structure of Afterthought. The Structure of Afterthought. I'll try to email everything as well. So what I'd like to do today is to give you a broad background of my sense of what social theory is and how it relates to other social sciences, including, of course, sociology, and how it has tried to make sense of the world in which we live. So first, what is theory? Well, essentially, there are many, many definitions. OED is an acronym for Oxford English Dictionary, the most authoritative dictionary in the English language. And it's essentially a definition that you more or less know already. It's essentially a set of ideas that try to explain a particular set of phenomena. And this definition comes out largely in Europe in 17th century at the time of the scientific revolution associated with scientists like Galileo, Newton, and others. It's essentially to come up with theory of X, whatever X may be. So it could be theory of gravity, theory about light, and essentially an effort to come up with systematic and abstract explanation. for a particular order of phenomena. So theory is simple enough, but what is social? When we talk about social theory, what are we trying to get at? Again, if one goes by philology, study of historical origins of words, it comes from Latin, meaning friend or companion. And again, if you look at Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find definitions that pertain to our understanding of what social is. It's essentially relationship with other human beings. And in particular, when it's generalized as society, it refers to what we think of usually as the nation state. So Taiwan, many people would think it's a society. If you go to China, of course, you're not really a society anymore. You're just part of China. However, there's a puzzle then. It's very clear what theory is, and it's very clear to you what social is, or what society is. It's a very commonsensical notion. And yet, when we look at history of ideas, it turns out that social theory as such has a very late origin. It began quite late in history of European thought. Sociology is usually said to have been coined by Auguste Comte in 1830 or so. And certainly you can find precursors, people who said something like social theory before Comte. Most famously, Quetelet, who proposed the idea of social physics. There's a book written recently by an MIT physicist called Social Physics, but the very title was used over 200 years ago. You can go back even further. Sometimes people will turn to Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws as the first work of social theory, and yet it's published in 1748. So the question I'm posing is, why was it that social theory did not come to be until quite late, until 18th century? Now, of course, if you are a historian of ideas, you immediately think of precursors. So you might talk about Greek philosophers like Plato or Aristotle. In Chinese philosophy, Han Pei-Tu said something like social theory. In Islamic philosophy, same with Ibn Khaldun, so on and on. And there have been systematic efforts to make sense of what we would think of as social life in varieties of state-based knowledge formations. William Petty, who talked about what we call arithmetic, it's a form of demography. Or in Germany, people talk about Kameralwissenschaft, which is essentially a way to make the state work better. And yet I would argue, and most people would probably agree with me, that these were not social theory. They're not really social theory. And I can give you many, many different reasons, the most obvious of which is that they're really philosophy in the sense of morals, or ethics, or moralizing, and there wasn't as much analysis. But the fundamental problem, the fundamental lack in these philosophies, I would argue, is the lack of the idea of society. These people did not have the modern notion of what society is. If I'm talking too fast, just raise your hand. To become theory of something, to become social theory then, we need to have some object, something called society that we can theorize about. To have theory of gravity, you need to have an understanding of what gravity is. Similarly, to have social theory, we need to understand what society is. And the point I'm trying to make is a very simple one. That until about 18th century in Europe, people did not have a notion of society in this modern sense. In early part of modern Europe, of course, people had words that today mean society. In French, monde, le monde. In German, société. And yet these words actually referred not to the entire society, was not to the entire population, but rather to the elite, to the aristocracy. Today in English, in America and England, we still talk about entering society. So young girls would go to a special dance party in which they are said to enter society, right? Society dinners. And these retain the older notion of what society meant, meaning a select elite group of people. It's only around 18th century that in French and German that people begin to think about society in the modern sense, about everyone in a particular area, everyone in a particular territory. So these are the words that we use today in French, société, in German, Gesellschaft. And these words are new words, neologisms, that come to express our notion of what society is. It's the totality, everyone living, say in Taiwan, part of Taiwanese society. Everyone living in German territory being Germans. And this notion, I want to suggest, really arose only in 18th century in Europe and was imported into East Asia in 19th century. Probably the first use was done in Japan in the 1870s. The Chinese characters were used around mid-1870s in Japan, made famous later by Fuzawa Yukichi, the famous philosopher in Japan, and then exported to China, Korea, and elsewhere. But before then, we didn't have in East Asia, just as much in Europe, a convenient vocabulary to express totality of people in a given territory. Why is that? Well, I want to suggest that there are two main reasons why this was. Two reasons why the notion of society, the modern notion of society, didn't arise in the West or the East for that matter. One, of course, is the idea that most polities, most territories were not integrated. They were not integrated linguistically in terms of people speaking the same language, people sharing the same religion or values, or people sharing the same culture, a way of life. To give you a very simple example, at the time of the French Revolution in 1789, we think, according to historians, that perhaps 1/4, 25% of people spoke French. And probably over half the people in what we today call France didn't have any idea what French was. The reason, of course, is that there was no linguistic unification in France. People spoke different dialects. That is to say, in the absence of mass education, mass media, newspapers, radios, mass transportation, you do not have the condition of possibility of cultural integration. Today, of course, if you go to France, except for immigrants, of course, people more or less speak French. But that's because they all go to schools where they are taught French, they watch TV, listen to radios, and read newspapers or their telephone screens, and French becomes part of being what French society means. Similarly, in China or Taiwan, you have the vast majority of people who speak the same language, Hudong. But this is in China largely a 20th century phenomenon. Until then, people in different areas spoke different dialects, so there was no easy communication among people living in China. At the elite level, of course, people could read Chinese characters, just like in Europe. At the elite level, people could read French, and if you're truly elite, you could read Latin. But for the whole population, that level of linguistic unification simply did not exist until 18th 19th or perhaps even 20th century. So to put it very simply, this modern notion we have of society, for everyone in that society share a certain set of properties, speaking the same language, knowing the same sort of history, national history, sharing some cultural tidbits, TV shows, famous political figures, pop music stars. These things are products largely of the 20th century. Before that, you did not have national cultural integration. So that's one reason. To talk of society in abstract, or even to talk about France, or Germany, or China, or Japan, in the 18th century made no sense for most people, because for most people there was only their village, or perhaps their region. Outside of the village, outside of the region, people were foreigners. They didn't speak the same language, didn't necessarily believe in the same things, and didn't share in the way of life. So that's what the first reason, lack of cultural integration. The second, and I think just as important reason, is the lack of status integration. Today, if I ask you in Taiwan whether your prime minister is Taiwanese, of course you would say yes. And if I ask you, the beggar begging in front of your university is Taiwanese, you probably say yes too. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless, people are said to belong to the same society. It doesn't matter, because you were born in Taiwan, you grew up in Taiwan, you're Taiwanese. Similarly in France, unless you're immigrant, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, powerful or powerless, you're all French. And yet this is a very modern notion. This is a post-democratic, post-French revolutionary notion of status integration. Before 18th century in Europe, and by and large in East Asia before 20th century, people didn't think of people in different status group being in the same group. If you're an aristocrat, peasants were different races of people. Right? Because the whole point of state society is you differentiate yourself from others. So to be a rich landlord meant that you were a different kind of people from poor peasants tilling the earth. And in different societies, as we think of it, people had different languages to explain this. In Europe, very often in medieval and early modern age, people talked about how aristocrats had blue blood, whereas peasants presumably didn't have blue blood because they had to work outside, they were suntanned, and you couldn't see the blue vein. But in general, throughout early modern Europe and East Asia, people didn't have a sense of status integration precisely because status-based societies precluded or prevented that way of thinking. The idea that everyone in society belong to the same people, they are the same kind of people, is a very, very modern notion. And I want to suggest that society becomes possible to imagine. We begin to think of French society or Taiwanese society precisely when we have cultural integration of some sort, and we have status integration. And these two forms of integration were propelled by Industrial Revolution, most obviously in terms of vast improvements in communication, transportation. In terms of the Democratic Revolution, that allowed status integration. Again, in a democratic society, we believe that everyone, in theory at least, is equal and takes part in society. And the third is what I sometimes call social, and other times I call disciplinary revolution. It's essentially the idea that we begin to think in modern categories of identity, such as nation. And these social changes merge with the nascent budding discourse that arises in early 19th century Europe by people like Comte, Herbert Spencer in England, and others to create the social sciences or social theory. And this, of course, becomes transported, disseminated to the rest of the world. As I mentioned, it comes to Japan roughly in the 1870s, the idea of Spencer, Stuart Mill, Auguste Comte, and others, and they began to try to apply these new ideas of society, to make sense of their own society. Now, as I mentioned, social theory arises largely coeval or at the same time as the birth of society, probably somewhat later. You might say, what's the difference, though, between social theory and social sciences? Well, there's a one minor difference, which is, of course, that social sciences actually arise later. I'll mention this very briefly soon. But there are two other key distinctions, in my opinion. What distinguishes social theory from social sciences is, one, that it's not only interdisciplinary, it's actually transdisciplinary. Social theory tries to understand, in a whole, what the movement, what the constituents, what the bases of society is or are. It tries to understand politics, economics, social, psychological in one integrated package. But second, and very controversially, social theory is different because I believe that it's deeply value-laden. Social sciences, modern social scientists, tries to be value neutral. It's a science, so therefore it doesn't take sides, or it pretends it has no value commitments. And to backtrack a bit, to me, or for me, and for many others, the birth of social theory actually begins with an obscure Neapolitan from Naples, Italian philosopher named Giambattista Vico, in his book called The New Science. He is famous retrospectively for what's now known as Verum Factum thesis. Essentially, he was trying to criticize René Descartes and his philosophy. Descartes, if you remember your high school world history class, tried to argue that you find truth in observation. But Vico suggested that as much as one may find truth in observation, truth is actually found or made in creation. There's a very famous passage in The New Science where he talks about how it's very strange that philosophers until him have focused on the natural world, physics, chemistry, as we would call it. Because he says, God made nature, so he, God, can know it. That was his argument. And he finds it strange that philosophers have ignored the social world, which he believes we, or human beings, can understand it because we made it. So it's this idea that we can come to understand things that we have made. So to reconstruct this somewhat logically, I would suggest that the fundamental syllogism, the fundamental logic of social theory is this, that one, human beings, we, or our ancestors, our parents and grandparents and so on, have made the world in which they live. This must be true. I think it's not true. It cannot not be true, unless you truly believe that God just made it. And the second point is that because we, or they made it, we can come to understand it. But the most important point for me is the third one. The idea then is that because we can understand it, we can also change it. So it's a chain of reasoning that I think is fundamental to social theory. The idea that we made a world, because we made it, we can know it, and because we can know it, we can remake it, or we can make it better than it has been made. So I want to suggest that what social theory is yes, it's scientific, because it's a systematic effort to understand the world,